Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources.
Well, what does good enough even look like? And if you can't actually measure that, then what are you moving towards? Like, you're always moving the goalposts. When you just say, you're aiming for this like perfection, which we know cognitively that doesn't exist, that perfection doesn't exist. But people think, on the other side of this milestone, then you'll feel good enough. But it doesn't happen. You end up with this feeling of like, well, is this it? Am I supposed to be happy now? And you're just pushing your happiness further and further away. Those goalposts are constantly moving. It's a dangling carrot that you're never going to reach.
You're listening to the Positively Living Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zaratny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a productivity coach certified in positive psychology and stress management. Join me as we explore ways to live a more proactive, positive life with episodes on productivity, self-awareness, mindset, entrepreneur life, habits and systems, simplicity, fun, and more. I understand overwhelm personally as a multi-passionate entrepreneur, wife and mom to kids and cats, and as a caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. Welcome to the Positively Living Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa, and today's episode is dedicated to all the perfectionists who are exhausted trying to keep up. If you resonate with this label, perfectionist, if you've struggled to take action because it has to be just right, if you've beaten yourself up for all you've done wrong, not even noticing what you've done right, and when you feel like you're just not enough because you can't reach that level that you want, it's time to listen to this episode. Here to help me with this topic is recovered perfectionist Steph Ellen Diplock. A fellow multi-passionate, Steph is a mindset coach, energetic healer, certified yoga teacher, and equine veterinarian. She works with high achievers to let go of perfectionism and self-sabotage to live their purpose without hustle. In our conversation, we cover what perfectionism is and where it comes from, how to distinguish it from high standards and high achievement, and the steps we can take today to free ourselves from this coping mechanism that causes more issues than we might realize. I've included some episodes from the podcast in the show notes that complement this one really well, including a recent one with Valerie Friedlander on releasing shame and rebuilding self-trust, taking back your self-worth with Jomana Elaridi, and Katie Lascelles' conversation about internal family systems. At one point, Steph and I discuss self-talk. You need to ask yourself what you are saying about you to you. And one of the things she mentions is how we celebrate what we do. She describes an important part of how I coach clients. When we meet regularly, we identify the wins and celebrate big. And yes, I will do ridiculous dances and even sing for you if you like. It's so easy to get caught up in life and what's next that we forget to give credit where it's due. So with that, I encourage you to celebrate your wins, and I encourage you to do so with me. Message me from my Connect page on the positivelyproductive.com website or DM me on social media. I would love to know, what have you accomplished lately? Big or small, even better if it's small. I will celebrate it with you. I'm here to cheer you on. Now let's join Steph. Welcome to the Positively Living Podcast, Steph. I am so delighted to talk to you today.
I'm so happy to be here. I can't wait to dive into this conversation.
I've been following you for a bit on the interwebs, and we connected a while back when you expressed an interest in coming onto the podcast, and I immediately loved what you were about. We were talking in the green room about how you see keywords that someone uses and you're like, oh yes, they're definitely my people. And your sensitivity, literally, toward others and trying to help them understand that sensitivity. This is the language that we speak here. So Before we dig into the topic of the day, recovering from perfectionism, I would love it if you would share a bit about who you are and what makes you light up.
Thank you so much. My name is Steph. I am what I consider to be a multi-passionate recovering perfectionist. I'm definitely someone who wears many hats, and that has been a thing that I've really put a lot of pressure on myself over the years to be sort of good at everything. And I know that a lot of people, especially, those who identify as women, those who are brought up as women for sure, there is often this pressure to be good at everything. This pressure can be internal, external. And so my journey has really been about trying to take off that pressure while still maintaining these high standards and still going after what we want in life. I would say what lights me up is really having that freedom, like that inner freedom to just actually enjoy life, to actually be present instead of worrying about how good it's going to be or worrying about past mistakes. I'd say what lights me up is those moments where I'm actually able to be truly present, whether that's in my career, whether that's in my business, whether that's horseback riding, whether it's running, whether it's reading, just the moments where I catch myself and I'm really present. That's it.
That sounds so good. It sounds so freeing. And in your description, a hint of what you've gone through, you have already started the process of answering my first question. What we want to do is lay the groundwork here and identify what does it mean to be a perfectionist and where does it come from too?
So, perfectionism is one of the sneakiest forms of self sabotage, and it's probably one of the most glorified coping mechanisms because you're often rewarded for being a perfectionist. I'm sure that if any of you listening relate to the term perfectionist, you've probably thought or even said in like an interview when people ask you what your flaw is or what's your biggest weakness, you're like, oh, well, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. Because even in that, there's this effort to not be seen in a negative way, and you're trying to use your high standards as like a measure of your worth. But perfectionism is not about high standards. Perfectionism really is the shiny suit of armor that we put on to try and minimize the feeling of shame and the feeling of not being good enough. And in my work, I work with highly sensitive high performers, which, to be honest, that phrase could almost be synonymous with perfectionism. Because if you're highly sensitive, you're someone who feels things really intensely, you think about things deeply, and you may notice subtleties that other people don't even recognize. And that means little mistakes as well. And that means you perceive your own flaws with a greater intensity that some people might not even notice. And perfectionism, there can be many different routes to it. And it can be as, the typical thing we think of is having, a harsh critic in your life growing up. If you hear, someone else's voice telling you you're making a mistake, you may be able to pinpoint that. But it's not always like that. Sometimes it is a way that we try to control things. This was certainly true for me, that when you feel out of control, you try and control what you can, and that might be your performance. That might be getting good marks at school. It might be focused on your appearance. So there are many different ways it can manifest, but at its core, it is a attempt to minimize shame, which is not really as sexy as perfectionism. It's just having high standards.
This is not necessarily going to be a linear conversation here because it's all wrapped up, but you are illustrating so well what I say so often, which is it's all connected, right? It's all in this like endless feedback loop. And we just had a conversation, which I know you've listened to, with Valerie Friedlander about shame and what all's going into that. And so it sounds to me, if I understand this correctly, that you're saying that perfectionism is a coping mechanism that acts like an armor to shame.
Yes, it attempts to be.
Yes. But it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that it's intended to do that, but probably makes matters worse.
It absolutely does. And it often doesn't present in the way that some people think it will either, because you might have this idea of what you think a perfectionist looks like. One of the interesting things that I witness time and time again with clients is that actually, they either say it or they express it in another way, that they don't feel good enough to be a perfectionist. They don't feel like they have the right qualifications, or they don't feel like they've achieved enough to be deemed a perfectionist. And when you hear that out loud, you probably can already see, looking up someone externally, that is perfectionism. Like, you don't think you're good enough for this label. This is because a lot of perfectionists end up actually procrastinating a lot of the time, because you do that as a way to protect yourself. Because if you never hand it in, if you never finish something, you're never going to get the negative feedback. So you're trying to avoid that failure by never doing it in the first place. And you can imagine how that piles on the shame as well. Because you're like, I never even finish anything. Like, why can't I motivate myself? Why can't I just get it done? It's such a sneaky form of self-sabotage. And it's devastating, to be honest. It's a devastating internal experience, never feeling like you're living up to these standards. And it also blocks you, as you're calling it an armor there, it blocks you from authentic connection, because you're always wearing this mask. You're always trying to hide parts of yourself that you've deemed unworthy. But, that is such a barrier to authentic connection and vulnerability.
Yeah, you're connecting yourself with this identity that doesn't necessarily exist. But if you're not that thing, then what? And it becomes like, I think, a constant feedback loop to the shame that you were trying to block in the first place. And I think, yeah, the visual of the armor is really good because, yes, armor can protect from potential threat, but it also blocks you from connection. And so we don't connect to our true self that way. All right. So we have this armor, if you will, this coping mechanism and the procrastination one. So go ahead, raise your hand. I'm going to raise both of mine if that's ever happened. It feels like it feeds right into this not good enough message, right? This loop on repeat. And so we don't dare hand something in or do the thing unless it can be perfect. And I call that a kind of clutter in our lives, because it's the busy work, right? Where we just keep going. We get ready to get ready to get ready. We do the research, we research more. And I feel like for those identifying as women, that happens even more so, where we are inclined to be like, I don't know if that's quite ready, if I'm quite ready. So we want this thing. Is there a way to say what perfect is, or is that really the issue? Because that's how I describe it. I'm like, it's like a GPS without like a final destination.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question to ask, isn't it? It's like, well, what does good enough even look like? And if you can't actually measure that, then what are you moving towards? Like, you're always moving the goalposts. Like, I often get my clients to reflect on a time where something did feel good enough. And it's so hard for them to do that, because when you just say, oh, you're aiming for this like perfection, which we know cognitively that doesn't exist, that perfection doesn't exist. But people think, oh, on the other side of this milestone, then you'll feel good enough. But it doesn't happen. You end up with this feeling of like, well, is this it? Am I supposed to be happy now? And you're just pushing your happiness further and further away. Those goalposts are constantly moving. It's a dangling carrot that you're never going to reach. So it's so important to recognize that.
When I was thinking about it, and you brought this up right out of the gate, and I love it, where, we're in an interview and it's like, oh, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. Like, this is this wonderful thing. It's something that we elevate. And I think it's because we connect it to this idea of having high standards, wanting something to be really, really good quality. How do we make the distinction, or what do we look for between you're someone who you're a high achiever, you want to have high standards, and you want to do something incredibly well, and you want to do the very best, be the very best, versus now you've gone over into perfectionism and it's a problem. How do we make that distinction, Steph?
Again, it's not always linear, because there will be different areas of your life where you'll feel this more intensely. One of the things that I always want people to look at is like, how often do you celebrate your successes? Because we have this evolutionary bias, to look towards the negative for survival. We want to avoid that pain. So we're trying to find ways to avoid that possible rejection, to avoid that failure. And we do have this natural negativity bias that you don't often spot the things that you've done well. And that's even why at the very start I was saying about those moments of being present, because as someone who was deep in perfectionism for so many years, when I catch myself in those moments of just being present and just being happy with the moment, like those are the powerful turning points. Let your nervous system know that it's, it's safe to be in the present. It's safe to be in this moment, making progress rather than perfection. That's the cliche we hear all the time. And on one side, it's celebrating those wins, making sure that you take time to reflect on them. And it's also watching how you speak to yourself when you don't meet that high standards. And noticing if you then create stories around that. If you're like, okay, well, I didn't hit my income goal in my business this month. Do you look at that with a more constructive lens of, okay, like we can look where we can improve, we can reflect, we can use that powerful self-awareness to actually move forward? Or are you then creating a story being like, no one signed up to my program. That's because I'm a failure. That's because I didn't work hard enough. That's because I didn't get this right. And you can see the difference between, okay, no one signed up. What did go well? What can I change? And between like getting stuck in this like shame spiral. So it's starting to change your self-awareness to reflection rather than rumination, and having a compassionate lens to it, which takes a lot of practice. If you've been speaking to yourself, like you're something unsavory that you've stepped on, it's something on the bottom of your shoe. Most people speak to themselves like that, unfortunately. Whereas training yourself to be more compassionate takes time, but that is the heart of all of this.
Absolutely. What you're talking about, the phrase we use on the podcast a lot is being curious. And when you approach things in that way, in curiosity about yourself, first of all, that promotes self-awareness. You hit one of the major keywords here, self-awareness. And then also, when you remain curious, you bypass the judgment part. So if I'm understanding correctly, there's two key things here. It's almost like they watch out for. One is celebrating, and I love doing that with clients. I love taking the wins, and even here's a tip for you, like trying toward a habit. And I've mentioned this in habits episodes before, where you are making the attempt. A lot of times we'll try to celebrate the result, which I understand, but celebrating the attempt is really important. How many times did you try to do it, as well as how many times did you succeed, and what does that even mean? And being very clear, like you said, what is the good enough? I've done that with a lot of clients where it's like right out of the gate, we have to address what it would look like to be like, yep, that will be a win. I will take the W when it looks like this. So how much do you celebrate? What does that look like? And then the second thing you said is, okay, and if you don't reach that goal, if you don't hit that point of, what you wanted something to look like, how do you treat yourself when that happens? Are you kind, like a friend of yours, like comes to you and says, oh, I wanted to get an A, I got a B. I wanted to work out 6 times this week and I only got 3. And what would you say to that friend? That's what we're about here. But you're right. Instead, what do? We're on ourselves. So I think it's the distinction of you can have high values. You can have whatever values and standards that you want, but how do you treat yourself in the process of achieving them? Is that right?
Absolutely. It's all about that compassionate striving. Many people may be familiar with the Diary of a CEO podcast. Stephen Bartlett, who's on this, he often talks about being driven or dragged to your goals. And he often says that he actually feels like he's dragged, like there's an element of it that is stemming from an unstable childhood, etc., etc. And I actually love that distinction of like, are you being driven by like a genuine passion? Because there's absolutely nothing wrong with having high standards and having a huge vision. Even when I'm talking about taking messy action and, allowing yourself to see failure as feedback, you're not going out there to actively fail. That's okay. And there's times when, mistakes do have significant consequences. And we know now that self-compassion is actually the greatest builder of resilience. And there's actual evidence, there's science behind that Dr. Kristen Neff, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who does a lot of the work on self-compassion, like they have shown that resilience is formed through self-compassion. It's not from beating yourself up. So this stuff works, and you don't have to sacrifice your high standards in order to be kind to yourself in the process.
I love that. Being driven and wanting to do well, all of these things are innately wonderful. Always makes me think of like the phrase, the poison is in the dose, right? And so, but it's really what you're doing with it. And it makes so much sense that self-compassion is the driver of resilience, because the self-compassion says, it's okay, Steph, you can do it again tomorrow. Lisa, you tried so hard. You put in all this effort, and look how far you did get. That's fantastic. It's that kind of language. And you think about it outwardly. People who in your life, mentors and teachers and coaches, who, when they speak to you that way and encourage you to try again. But if you're like, oh, what was that? That was such a failure, the F word, the other F word. When you hear that, you want to probably just give up, right? Or you want to maybe do the avoidance thing, right? Where it makes you less inclined again. And so you're like, okay, well, I better get it right if I'm ever going to do it again. And then you get into that procrastination loop. So these are the things to look for and to identify. And if we're listening right now and we're like, oh, yep, Steph. Okay, called it. Check. Oh my goodness, check. Yes, you know me, Steph. What are some next steps that we can take to build that self-compassion, to course correct, to be driven versus dragged, to be approaching this in a way that's positive instead of perfectionist?
So there's a few different paths that we can go down with this. But for me, the most important thing is, this is my opinion and my experience with working with so many different perfectionists, is that you can't necessarily think your way out of this. Like a lot of perfectionists who come into the personal development space or therapy, they're actually very self-aware, a lot of them. And they're actually good at analyzing, almost to a fault. There's a habit to overthink and then to find, more things that are wrong with them that they need to fix. These are the clients that come to the first session with like a color-coded list of problems they want to work through. The most important thing from my perspective, the way that I work with clients, is to actually start with the body first, to actually start with a nervous system approach. Because analyzing these things on that real like cognitive, like logical level, yes, we will do that at some point, absolutely. But a lot of the time, there is an inherent feeling of feeling unsafe to make mistakes or unsafe to loosen control. And often working in this very activated fight or flight response, this very go, 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 we've got to get everything done. And then often, going into burnout. So going into more of a freeze response of now I can't do anything. We're in this cycle of overworking followed by this crash and burn. So finding a way to get to a regulated state, discovering what safety feels like to you. So when is it that you feel safe? For me, it's like having when my cats come and we have a cuddle in the morning and I'm enjoying my cup of tea or my coffee and the sun's coming up and I've got a cat purring on me, that feels like safety. Finding those little moments that we can actually bring yourself back to that state, because doing any of this work from a dysregulated state is just going to perpetuate more shame. And it's going to be this like frantic, I need to fix myself. I'm so broken. So we want to do it from a regulated state and finding little moments through the day to create that internal sense of safety. So you're less likely to be trying to find it externally by getting the perfect result or by doing more work than everybody else or doing everything for everyone else.
Okay. So it's a practice that gives you an alternative coping mechanism, essentially.
Yeah, more like self-regulation.
I absolutely agree. I love tapping into the nervous system part of it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you. So would you also, I'm thinking about what this might look like. So what you're describing is moments throughout the day. This is a very simple, straightforward kind of habit that you do to practice what that feels like. Would you then consider applying that or tapping into that in some way, or maybe replicating that thing. If you have a cat handy, I'm all about a cup of coffee and a cat on my lap. That's absolutely one of my happy places. But would you consider doing that maybe during one of those moments where you are trying to process something you've perceived as a failure? We were talking before about how you treat yourself when something doesn't go right. Would you want to connect those two like in a timely fashion?
Absolutely. But often, a lot of clients I work with, going from there to there is actually quite a jump. And so my background as well that I haven't mentioned yet, but it is relevant, is that I am actually a vet. So I'm a veterinarian. So I've worked in very high pressure, high stakes environments where, a mistake can literally be life or death. And it can be absolutely devastating. And there's no point, and it's actually almost harmful in a way, for me to go and tell someone, "I'll just make mistakes at work," and just take a few deep breaths when you do that, like get comfortable with it. Because they're like, well, that's easy for you to say, but my mistakes are more costly. So the sort of stepping stone to this, because unfortunately we're never going to be able to avoid mistakes, like things will happen, and you need to find a way to reflect on them compassionately and move forward. But the sort of middle step of this that I get people to do is to make mistakes and be willing to look like a beginner and have that beginner's curious mindset in things where the stakes are less high. So perhaps that could be a hobby that you've never done before. It could be, to be fair, this would be even a stretch a little bit for me, but like an improv class or something like that, something where you are out of your comfort zone, but the stakes are not that high. You are doing an art class or a music class, particularly if it's something your inner child loves, something you loved as a kid. So stretching your capacity to be a beginner and to be uncomfortable in different areas of life. And then we sort of graduate to the areas that your nervous system really does feel like it would be absolutely devastating to make a mistake in. So there's like safety in sort of everyday moments, safety where the stakes aren't quite so high. And then once you've got these skills, like you've trained this muscle, you've built this self-trust, you've built this resilience, and you just gradually expand your capacities, your nervous system's window of tolerance, that place where you are not necessarily calm all the time, because that's not what nervous system regulation is about, but it's spending more time in a place where you feel capable, where you feel like you can actually ride the waves of life without getting overwhelmed, without getting into a state where you are so activated you can't bring yourself down, or when you're even completely shut down. So it's a progressive overload, really. It's like you wouldn't go to the gym and just pick up try and deadlift like 200 kilos if you've never done it before. It's really that progressive overload. It's like, let's go and flex this muscle, let's build some strength, and then we can build our capacity for more.
So you're practicing tapping into that safe place with the nervous system. And then I love this tip, practice making mistakes. What you're telling me, I think, is that all this time that I've showed up and I've bowled horribly, I'm talking like I could get a gutter ball even with like the bumpers up. I'm that bad. So you're telling me that was good practice for getting myself out of perfectionism.
Absolutely. As long as you were being kind to yourself in the process, that you weren't then saying like, oh, why am I so bad at this? I'm the worst person ever, and then never doing it again. Every time you get back up and do it and laugh about it.
Fair enough. Most of the time I was like, well, I'll be most improved if I can get there. And mostly I'm laughing at myself. And it's really one of the situations that I use where it's something I'm not good at, but I still have fun. You made me think of that when you were describing, going back to that being multi-passionate. I wonder if part of the challenge that we have and that we might be inclined to as multi-passionates is because the very nature of being multi-passionate has a tendency to be quite good at many things. So then there becomes this expectation that, okay, you're in that zone of trying all the different things. You're open to that because of your very nature. And then you try something, you're like, holy smokes, I'm horrible. Like, what just happened here? And then that can really throw you. So we have to not get into that trap. It's okay to try the things The other thing about the practicing mistakes that I love is that there are so many things we can tap into that can be so beneficial to us when we let go of the achievement part of it, the results, the what are you going to do with this? I'm thinking especially in the creative zone, like of art and music. It's like, well, it doesn't have to be for performance in front of people. It doesn't have to be a business. It doesn't have to look like the next Picasso. You can go to the paint and sip and be horrible and and have fun with your friends and appreciate. This goes back to your mindfulness point, right? The being fully present. You can appreciate the moment and the experience without worrying about the result. That now we're talking about all kinds of great conversations we've had on the podcast about rest and play and releasing that inner critic and just being present. And I feel like that comes full circle to your point about that freedom that we can have when we release that need to have the result.
Absolutely.
It sounds so good. And I love it. These are our steps that we can take. And it's small, like any habit, right? We start small, but it has a compound effect and we need to trust that.
Yeah, for sure. There is another part of it as well. Like that's more the body base of it, but as a bit of a just pulling it together as well, because when you're creating these habits, you're creating these patterns in your nervous system to let you know that it's safe to make mistakes. There are still going to be like unconscious drivers protecting you, unconscious stories that you have created often in childhood. So this is where doing the subconscious work, I think, is so powerful as well. But I always like to do the nervous system regulation first and really build that muscle because, as we were saying, like that self-awareness and deep subconscious work without doing that from a regulated place is just going to further perpetuate shame. Like it needs to be done in a way that your body feels safe to actually even allow you to go there, because there are often so many stories that we've created, and I like to call them like survival stories, because it's what we've learned to survive, what we've learned to get love, acceptance, belonging from caregivers, from others. And so then doing the work with a practitioner or, you know, the journaling, there are exercises you can do, but finding these stories and attempting to process them, rewire them, and start to create new stories around it's safe to make mistakes. You know, it's safe to, like, I am good enough. Like, good enough is good enough. So there's like different layers to this.
And that's good to know from a big picture standpoint. So as we walk away today feeling encouraged, it's tap into the nervous system, find the calm, find the safe feeling, and it's the practice mistakes. Those two things, I think, are steps we can take today. And then there'll be work after that, but that's a great starting point. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave us with today? Something you really hoped to make sure that we take away, or just a point of encouragement?
Just you don't have to be good at your hobbies. You can just do things for fun. That's a lesson that I need to tell myself a lot as well, even doing this work. I think that just summarizes that last part, but you don't have to be good at your hobbies. You can just enjoy things.
That's life advice right there. And that is a wonderful place for us to wrap up. And so before we get into the quick and fun rapid wrap up at the end, tell us where we can find you online, Steph.
Thank you so much. So my handle is at Finding Flow State. I'm mostly on Instagram, also a little bit on TikTok and Threads, but mainly Instagram. And I have a podcast as well, which is also called Finding Flow State.
Wonderful. Okay, I'll make sure to have those in the show notes so we can find you and keep in touch. And now, you ready for that rapid wrap up?
I'm not so good at the rapid, but we'll try.
Well, we'll see. It's less about the rapid and more about identifying things that inspire positively living, basically.
Mm-hmm.
A song, a saying, and a resource is what I'm hoping for. So let's start with a song.
So what I always run to, weirdly, is Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie. And that's the only song that's the only song that's coming to me. And I think it just like, it has this like beautiful, I don't know, it's got this beautiful energy to it, but it's like so profound. And I feel like that's just, it's not super positive, but it's also, yeah, I mean, Under Pressure for a perfectionist. I mean, let's be honest.
Seriously, Steph, it's so on brand for this conversation. I'm taking it. I'm running with it. I am putting it on the Positively Living podcast Spotify playlist. I might start like volume 4 now. It's a great song. It's totally on brand. I love it. Now, is there a saying? It could be a mantra, a quote, anything like that, either that you share a lot or you love or it's hanging on your wall, just something that you hold on to and you're like, yeah, that's the stuff.
I'm going to be that person that quotes themselves because
Sure.
my favorite thing that I say to myself and my clients is self-awareness without self-compassion is just giving your inner critic a megaphone.
Oh,
Time and time again, I come back to that.
love that. Exactly. You want to be self-aware, but you have to be kind about it. Okay. And now, do you have a resource? It could be a book, an app, aside from your podcast, something that just helps you live a better life.
So the first thing that comes to mind is actually using binaural beats, which is a bit of a off left field suggestion there, but using sounds, using that to help my nervous system. I use it for focus. I use it for sleep. I use it for the meditations I do. So yeah, just finding something that feels good to your nervous system and helps me switch between tasks.
I actually really love that because, and one of the reasons I got into asking about songs is because that can definitely impact our nervous system. And then the binaural beats, I've actually listened to those as well. So I love that suggestion. I'll make sure to have links to these in the show notes. And then last but definitely not least, we're going to do one more bonus thing. I'd love to share some gratitude with you today. So what or who contributes to positively living for you?
So my trail running group that I'm just being near the mountain, just outside of Melbourne at the moment, and I run with a women's group every 2 weeks, and I'm just thinking about them at the moment because running for me is just my happy place, and trail running especially because it's all about the views and the snacks. It's all about just getting up the hill. It's not about how fast you get up the hill. So trail running is a great thing to do for recovering perfectionists.
I love that. And I hope that they hear this. So yeah, definitely shout out to that wonderful group for being a support to you. That's what we need to be able to support each other in all of our endeavors. And most importantly, in our endeavors to be self-compassionate and to cheer each other on. So to that point, I cheer you on and I appreciate you. I'm so grateful for you and that we connected and that you came here and you shared your wisdom today. So thank you, Steph, for shining your light so brightly in this world and sharing it with us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.